Audio Renaissance presents The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John J. Mearsheimer and Stephen M. Walt. Read for you by Jason Culp. In all affairs, it's a healthy thing now and then to hang a question mark on the things you have long taken for granted. Bertrand Russell. Preface. In the fall of 2002, the Atlantic Monthly invited us to write a feature article on the Israel lobby and its effects on U.S. foreign policy. We accepted the commission with some reservations because we knew this was a controversial subject and that any article that scrutinized the lobby, U.S. support for Israel, or Israeli policy itself was likely to provoke a harsh reaction. Nonetheless, we felt this was an issue that could no longer be ignored, especially in light of the September 11 terrorist attacks and the looming war with Iraq. If U.S. support for Israel was a significant source of anti-Americanism in the Middle East and a source of tension with key strategic allies, and if pro-Israel groups and individuals were a major influence on U.S. foreign policy in this vital region, then it was important to raise the issue openly and encourage public discussion of the lobby's actions and impact. We worked on the article off and on over the next 2 years, in close collaboration with the Atlantic's editors, and we sent them a manuscript conforming to our prior agreements and incorporating virtually all of their suggestions in January 2005. A few weeks later, to our surprise, the editor informed us that the Atlantic had decided not to run the piece and that he was not interested in our attempting to revise it. We considered submitting the article to several other journals, but concluded that they would be unlikely to run the piece, either due to its content or its length. We also considered the possibility of turning the article into a book, but responses to our initial inquiries were not sufficiently enthusiastic to convince us to commit additional time and effort to it. So we put the manuscript aside and turned to other projects, although an abbreviated version of some of this material was included in Stephen Walt's Taming American Power, which was published by W. W. Norton in September 2005. Then, in October 2005, a distinguished American academic contacted us and suggested that we consider publishing the article in the London Review of Books. Someone at the Atlantic had given him a copy of the rejected essay, and he told us he thought the editor of the LRB, Mary Kay Wilmers, would be interested. We sent her the manuscript, and she quickly expressed her desire to publish it. After another round of updating and revision, the article, now titled The Israel Lobby, was published in the March 23, 2006 issue. At the suggestion of one of the scholars who had read and commented on an earlier draft, we simultaneously posted a fully documented version of the article on the Faculty Working Papers website of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. We did this because the LRB's format does not allow for extensive references or footnotes, and we wanted readers to see that our argument rested on a wide array of credible sources. The case advanced in the article was straightforward. After describing the remarkable level of material and diplomatic support that the United States provides to Israel, we argued that this support could not be fully explained on either strategic or moral grounds. Instead, it was due largely to the political influence of the Israel Lobby, a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that actively works to shape U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. In addition to encouraging the United States to back Israel more or less unconditionally, groups and individuals in the lobby played key roles in shaping American policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the ill-fated invasion of Iraq, and the ongoing confrontations with Syria and Iran. We suggested that these policies were not in the U.S. national interest and were in fact harmful to Israel's long-term interests as well. The response to the essay was breathtaking. By July 2006, the Kennedy School's website had recorded more than 275,000 downloads of the working paper, and we had received numerous requests to translate or reprint the LRB article. As expected, the essay initially generated a firestorm of criticism from prominent groups or individuals in the lobby, and we were denounced as anti-Semites by the Anti-Defamation League and by op-ed writers in the Jerusalem Post, New York Sun, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. The New Republic devoted 4 separate articles to attacking our article, and a number of critics accused us, erroneously, of having made numerous historical or factual mistakes. A few critics even predicted that the article and its authors would soon fade into what they thought would be a richly deserved obscurity. They were wrong. A wide variety of readers, both Jewish and Gentile, came out in support of the article. They did not agree with every point we had made, of course, but almost all of them agreed that such an examination was long overdue. Predictably, reactions outside the United States were generally favorable, and there were even some positive responses in Israel itself. Respectful appraisals appeared in the New York Times, Financial Times, New York Review of Books, Chicago Tribune, New York Observer, National Interest, and Nation. And the controversy eventually received prominent coverage in a wide array of news outlets, from Haaretz in Israel to National Public Radio in the United States. The distinguished journal Foreign Policy organized a symposium on the article in its July-August 2006 issue, and the Washington Post Sunday magazine published a thoughtful cover story in July exploring the issues we had raised. Later that summer, a reviewer in Foreign Affairs described the article as a hard-headed analysis that might set in motion a useful paradigm shift in United States Middle East policy. Over the course of 2006, it became increasingly clear that the conversation about Israel and U.S. Middle East policy was indeed changing, and that it had become somewhat easier to discuss the lobby's role in shaping U.S. policy. This was not entirely our doing, of course, as awareness of the lobby's activities and impact was also increased by Israel's disastrous war in Lebanon in the summer of 2006, the continued debacle in Iraq, the personal attacks on Jimmy Carter following publication of his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, the simmering war of words between the United States and Iran, and the conspicuous but failed efforts to silence or smear other prominent critics of the lobby. A growing number of people seemed to realize that this subject needed airing, and more people were willing to speak out. Equally important, thoughtful people were beginning to recognize that the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and other hardline groups in the lobby, including some vocal Christian Zionists, were not representative of mainstream opinion in the American Jewish community or the United States more broadly. There was a growing debate about whether the policies advocated by these groups were in America's or in Israel's interest. As a result, a number of pro-Israel groups began to talk openly about the need to shift the balance of power in more moderate directions, and prominent publications such as The Economist and the New York Times published commentaries suggesting that it was time for a new relationship between Israel and the United States for the benefit of both. We were gratified by these developments because we wrote the original article in order to foster a more clear-eyed and candid discussion of this subject. That conversation was now underway, although it still tended to be shrill, confrontational, and overly personal. But should we write a book? Perhaps we had already said enough, and it was time to move on to other topics. After some reflection, and despite some lingering misgivings, we concluded that writing a book would help advance the dialogue in several ways. First, although the original article was long by the standards of most magazines, Space limitations had forced us to omit a number of important issues and to deal with certain topics more briefly than we would have liked. This unavoidable brevity may have contributed to some misunderstandings of the original article, and writing a book would provide an opportunity to present a more nuanced and detailed statement of our views. Accordingly, this book contains a more complete definition of the lobby, an extended discussion of the role of Christian Zionism, and a fuller account of the lobby's evolution over time. We also provide a more detailed account of Israel's past conduct and current behavior, especially toward the Palestinians. We do this not from any animus toward Israel or its supporters in the United States, or because we are eager to highlight Israeli misconduct. Rather, we address this topic because it is central to some of the moral arguments commonly used to justify an exceptional level of U.S. support for the Jewish state. We focus on Israel's behavior, in other words, because the United States focuses an extraordinary degree of support on Israel. We also address the controversial issue of dual loyalty, which was not discussed in the original article. Second, writing this book enables us to respond to the central criticisms that were lodged against our original article. We addressed some of them in 2 subsequent letters to the London Review of Books and in the Foreign Policy Symposium mentioned above, and we have also written a point-by-point rebuttal of the various charges directed at the article. See Setting the Record Straight, a response to critics of the Israel Lobby, available online at www.IsraelLobbyBook.com. Although the vast majority of charges leveled against the original article were unfounded, as were the various personal attacks leveled at us, there were a number of thoughtful critiques that raised important issues of interpretation and emphasis. We have learned from these criticisms, even when not fully persuaded by them, and we have tried to address them here. Third, writing a book makes it possible to provide further empirical support for our core claims and to bring the analysis up to date. Not only has additional evidence come to light regarding important events such as the Iraq War, but some other events, most notably the Second Lebanon War of July-August 2006, had not taken place when the original article appeared. America's response to that war proved to be a further illustration of the lobby's power, as well as its harmful influence on U.S. and Israeli interests. The lobby's activities could also be seen in the evolution of U.S. policy toward Iran and Syria, and in the harsh attacks on former President Jimmy Carter, historian Tony Judt, and several other prominent critics of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. Finally, this book presents an opportunity to discuss how the United States should advance its interests in the Middle East, and how Americans, and indeed the rest of the world, should think about the influence of the pro-Israel lobby. The stakes are high for Americans and non-Americans alike, because the Middle East is a volatile and strategically vital region, and America's policies toward that region will inevitably have extensive repercussions. As the war in Iraq demonstrates, the United States can do great damage to itself and to others if its policies are misguided. This fact makes it all the more important to identify what is driving U.S. policy and to figure out what that policy ought to be. Our original article did not offer much in the way of positive prescriptions, but the concluding chapter of this book outlines a different approach to U.S. Middle East policy and identifies how the lobby's power might be mitigated or made more constructive. Although we see encouraging signs of more open discussion on these vital issues, the lobby still has a profound influence on U.S. Middle East policy. The problems that the United States and Israel face in this region have not lessened since the original article appeared. Indeed, they may well have grown worse. Iraq is a fiasco. Israelis and Palestinians remain locked in conflict. Hamas and Fatah are battling for dominance within the Palestinian community, and Hezbollah's role in Lebanon is deeply troubling. Iran is still seeking to acquire full control of the nuclear fuel cycle. Groups like al-Qaeda remain active and dangerous, and the industrial world is still dependent on Persian Gulf oil. These are all vexing problems, and the United States will not be able to address any or all of them effectively if Americans cannot have a civilized conversation about our interests in the region and the role of all the factors that shape U.S. foreign policy, including the Israel lobby. To encourage that continued conversation, we have written this book. We acknowledge various personal debts at the end of the book, but we would like to register one of them here. For more than 25 years, we have been fortunate to enjoy the friendship and support of one of America's most accomplished social scientists, Samuel P. Huntington. We cannot imagine a better role model. Sam has always tackled big and important questions, and he has answered these questions in ways that the rest of the world could not ignore. Although each of us has disagreed with him on numerous occasions over the years, and sometimes vehemently and publicly, he never held those disagreements against us and was never anything but gracious and supportive of our own work. He understands that scholarship is not a popularity contest and that spirited but civil debate is essential both to scholarly progress and to a healthy democracy. We are grateful to Sam for his friendship and for the example he has set throughout his career, and we are pleased to dedicate this book to him. John J. Mearsheimer, University of Chicago, Stephen M. Walt, Harvard University. The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. Introduction. America is about to enter a presidential election year. Although the outcome is, of course, impossible to predict at this stage, certain features of the campaign are easy to foresee. The candidates will inevitably differ on various domestic issues: healthcare, abortion, gay marriage, taxes, education, immigration, and spirited debates are certain to erupt on a host of foreign policy questions as well. What course of action should the United States pursue in Iraq? What is the best response to the crisis in Darfur, Iran's nuclear ambitions, Russia's hostility to NATO, and China's rising power? How should the United States address global warming, combat terrorism, and reverse the erosion of its international image? On these and many other issues, we can confidently expect lively disagreements among the various candidates. Yet on one subject, we can be equally confident that the candidates will speak with one voice. In 2008, as in previous election years, serious candidates for the highest office in the land will go to considerable lengths to express their deep personal commitment to one foreign country, Israel, as well as their determination to maintain unyielding U.S. support for the Jewish state. Each candidate will emphasize that he or she fully appreciates the multitude of threats facing Israel and make it clear that, if elected, the United States will remain firmly committed to defending Israel's interests under any and all circumstances. None of the candidates is likely to criticize Israel in any significant way or suggest that the United States ought to pursue a more even-handed policy in the region. Any who do will probably fall by the wayside. This observation is hardly a bold prediction, because presidential aspirants were already proclaiming their support for Israel in early 2007. The process began in January, when 4 potential candidates spoke to Israel's annual Herzliya Conference on security issues. As Joshua Mitnick reported in Jewish Week, they were seemingly competing to see who can be most strident in defense of the Jewish state. Appearing via satellite link, John Edwards, the Democratic Party's 2004 vice presidential candidate, told his Israeli listeners that "your future is our future," and said that the bond between the United States and Israel will never be broken. Former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney spoke of being in a country I love with people I love, and, aware of Israel's deep concern about a possible nuclear Iran, proclaimed that it is time for the world to speak three truths. 1, Iran must be stopped. 2, Iran can be stopped. 3, Iran will be stopped. Senator John McCain, Republican Arizona, declared that when it comes to the defense of Israel, we simply cannot compromise. While former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, Republican Georgia, told the audience that Israel is facing the greatest danger for its survival since the 1967 victory. Shortly thereafter, in early February, Senator Hillary Clinton, Democrat, New York, spoke in New York before the local chapter of the powerful American Israel Public Affairs Committee, Aipac, where she said that in this moment of great difficulty for Israel and great peril for Israel, what is vital is that we stand by our friend and our ally, and we stand by our own values. Israel is a beacon of what's right in a neighborhood overshadowed by the wrongs of radicalism, extremism, despotism, and terrorism. One of her rivals for the Democratic nomination, Senator Barack Obama, Democrat Illinois, spoke a month later before an AIPAC audience in Chicago. Obama, who has expressed some sympathy for the Palestinians' plight in the past and made a brief reference to Palestinian suffering at a campaign appearance in March 2007, was unequivocal in his praise for Israel and made it manifestly clear that he would do nothing to change the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Other presidential hopefuls, including Senator Sam Brownback, Republican Kansas, and New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, have expressed pro-Israel sentiments with equal or greater ardor. What explains this behavior? Why is there so little disagreement among these presidential hopefuls regarding Israel, when there are profound disagreements among them on almost every other important issue facing the United States, and when it is apparent that America's Middle East policy has gone badly awry? Why does Israel get a free pass from presidential candidates when its own citizens are often deeply critical of its present policies, and when these same presidential candidates are all too willing to criticize many of the things that other countries do? Why does Israel, and no other country in the world, receive such consistent deference from America's leading politicians? Some might say that it is because Israel is a vital strategic asset for the United States. Indeed, it is said to be an indispensable partner in the war on terror. Others will answer that there is a powerful moral case for providing Israel with unqualified support, because it is the only country in the region that shares our values. But neither of these arguments stands up to fair-minded scrutiny. Washington's close relationship with Jerusalem makes it harder, not easier, to defeat the terrorists who are now targeting the United States, and it simultaneously undermines America's standing with important allies around the world. Now that the Cold War is over, Israel has become a strategic liability for the United States. Yet no aspiring politician is going to say so in public or even raise the possibility. There is also no compelling moral rationale for America's uncritical and uncompromising relationship with Israel. There is a strong moral case for Israel's existence, and good reasons for the United States to be committed to helping Israel if its survival were in jeopardy. But given Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians in the occupied territories, moral considerations might suggest that the United States pursue a more even-handed policy toward the two sides, and maybe even lean toward the Palestinians. Yet we are unlikely to hear that sentiment expressed by anyone who wants to be president, or anyone who would like to occupy a position in Congress. The real reason why American politicians are so deferential is the political power of the Israel lobby. The lobby is a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that actively work to move U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. As we will describe in detail, it is not a single unified movement with a central leadership, and it is certainly not a cabal or conspiracy that controls U.S. foreign policy. It is simply a powerful interest group made up of both Jews and Gentiles whose acknowledged purpose is to press Israel's case within the United States and influence American foreign policy in ways that its members believe will benefit the Jewish state. The various groups that make up the lobby do not agree on every issue, although they share the desire to promote a special relationship between the United States and Israel. Like the efforts of other ethnic lobbies and interest groups, the activities of the Israel lobby's various elements are legitimate forms of democratic political participation, and they are, for the most part, consistent with America's long tradition of interest group activity. Because the Israel lobby has gradually become one of the most powerful interest groups in the United States, candidates for high office pay close attention to its wishes. The individuals and groups in the United States that make up the lobby care deeply about Israel, and they do not want American politicians to criticize it, even when criticism might be warranted and might even be in Israel's own interest. Instead, these groups want U.S. leaders to treat Israel as if it were the 51st state. Democrats and Republicans alike fear the lobby's clout. They all know that any politician who challenges its policies stands little chance of becoming president. The lobby and U.S. Middle East policy. The lobby's political power is important not because it affects what presidential candidates say during a campaign, but because it has a significant influence on American foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. America's actions in that volatile region have enormous consequences for people all around the world, especially the people who live there. Just consider how the Bush administration's misbegotten war in Iraq has affected the long-suffering people of that shattered country. Tens of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands forced to flee their homes, and a vicious sectarian war taking place with no end in sight. The war has also been a strategic disaster for the United States and has alarmed and endangered U.S. allies both inside and outside the region. One could hardly imagine a more vivid or tragic demonstration of the impact the United States can have, for good or ill, when it unleashes the power at its disposal. The United States has had some involvement in the Middle East since the early days of the Republic, with much of the activity centered on educational programs or missionary work. For some, a biblically inspired fascination with the Holy Land and the role of Judaism in its history led to support for the idea of restoring the Jewish people to a homeland there, a view that was embraced by some prominent religious leaders and, in a general way, by some U.S. politicians. But it is a mistake to see this history of modest and, for the most part, private engagement as the taproot of America's role in the region since World War II, and especially its extraordinary relationship with Israel today. Between the routing of the Barbary pirates 200 years ago and World War II, the United States played no significant security role anywhere in the region, and U.S. leaders did not aspire to one. Woodrow Wilson did endorse the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which expressed Britain's support for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But Wilson did virtually nothing to advance this goal. Indeed, the most significant U.S. involvement during this period, a fact-finding mission dispatched to the region in 1919 by the Paris Peace Conference, under the leadership of Americans Henry Churchill King and Charles Crane, concluded that the local population opposed continued Zionist inroads and recommended against the establishment of an independent Jewish homeland. Yet, as historian Margaret Macmillan notes, nobody paid the slightest attention. The possibility of a U.S. mandate over portions of the Middle East was briefly considered but never pursued, and Britain and France ended up dividing the relevant portions of the Ottoman Empire between themselves. The United States has played an important and steadily increasing role in Middle East security issues since World War II, driven initially by oil, then by anti-communism, and over time by its growing relationship with Israel. America's first significant involvement in the security politics of the region was a nascent partnership with Saudi Arabia in the mid-1940s, intended by both parties as a check on British ambitions in the region. And its first formal alliance commitments were Turkey's inclusion in NATO in 1952 and the anti-Soviet Baghdad Pact in 1954. After backing Israel's founding in 1948, U.S. leaders tried to strike a balanced position between Israel and the Arabs, and carefully avoided making any formal commitment to the Jewish state for fear of jeopardizing more important strategic interests. This situation changed gradually over the ensuing decades, in response to events like the Six-Day War, Soviet arms sales to various Arab states, and the growing influence of pro-Israel groups in the United States. Given this dramatic transformation in America's role in the region, it makes little sense to try to explain current U.S. policy, and especially the lavish support that is now given to Israel, by referring to the religious beliefs of a bygone era or the radically different forms of past American engagement. There was nothing inevitable or predetermined about the current special relationship between the United States and Israel. Since the Six-Day War of 1967, a salient feature and arguably the central focus of America's Middle East policy has been its relationship with Israel. For the past 4 decades, in fact, the United States has provided Israel with a level of material and diplomatic support that dwarfs what it provides to other countries. That aid is largely unconditional. No matter what Israel does, the level of support remains, for the most part, unchanged. In particular, the United States consistently favors Israel over the Palestinians and rarely puts pressure on the Jewish state to stop building settlements and roads in the West Bank. Although Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush openly favored the creation of a viable Palestinian state, neither was willing to use American leverage to make that outcome a reality. The United States has also undertaken policies in the broader Middle East that reflected Israel's preferences. Since the early 1990s, for example, American policy toward Iran has been heavily influenced by the wishes of successive Israeli governments. Tehran has made several attempts in recent years to improve relations with Washington and settle outstanding differences, but Israel and its American supporters have been able to stymie any détente between Iran and the United States, and to keep the two countries far apart. Another example is the Bush administration's behavior during Israel's war against Lebanon in the summer of 2006. Almost every country in the world harshly criticized Israel's bombing campaign, a campaign that killed more than 1,000 Lebanese, most of them civilians. But the United States did not. Instead, it helped Israel prosecute the war, with prominent members of both political parties openly defending Israel's behavior. This unequivocal support for Israel undermined the pro-American government in Beirut, strengthened Hezbollah, and drove Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah closer together, results that were hardly good for either Washington or Jerusalem. Many policies pursued on Israel's behalf now jeopardize U.S. national security. The combination of unstinting U.S. support for Israel and Israel's prolonged occupation of Palestinian territory has fueled anti-Americanism throughout the Arab and Islamic world, thereby increasing the threat from international terrorism and making it harder for Washington to deal with other problems, such as shutting down Iran's nuclear programs. Because the United States is now so unpopular within the broader region, Arab leaders who might otherwise share U.S. goals are reluctant to help us openly, a predicament that cripples U.S. efforts to deal with a host of regional challenges. This situation, which has no equal in American history, is due primarily to the activities of the Israel lobby. While other special interest groups, including ethnic lobbies representing Cuban Americans, Irish Americans, Armenian Americans, and Indian Americans, have managed to skew U.S. foreign policy in directions that they favored, no ethnic lobby has diverted that policy as far from what the American national interest would otherwise suggest. The Israel lobby has successfully convinced many Americans that American and Israeli interests are essentially identical. In fact, they are not. Although this book focuses primarily on the lobby's influence on U.S. foreign policy and its negative effect on American interests, the lobby's impact has been unintentionally harmful to Israel as well. Take Israel's settlements, which even a writer as sympathetic to Israel as Leon Wieseltier recently called a moral and strategic blunder of historic proportions. Israel's situation would be better today if the United States had long ago used its financial and diplomatic leverage to convince Israel to stop building settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, and instead helped Israel create a viable Palestinian state on those lands. Washington did not do so, however, largely because it would have been politically costly for any president to attempt it. As noted above, Israel would have been much better off if the United States had told it that its military strategy for fighting the 2006 Lebanon War was doomed to fail, rather than reflexively endorsing and facilitating it. By making it difficult to impossible for the U.S. government to criticize Israel's conduct and press it to change some of its counterproductive policies, the lobby may even be jeopardizing the long-term prospects of the Jewish state. The lobby's modus operandi. It is difficult to talk about the lobby's influence on American foreign policy, at least in the mainstream media in the United States, without being accused of anti-Semitism or labeled a self-hating Jew. It is just as difficult to criticize Israeli policies or question U.S. support for Israel in polite company. America's generous and unconditional support for Israel is rarely questioned, because groups in the lobby use their power to make sure that public discourse echoes its strategic and moral arguments for the special relationship. The response to former President Jimmy Carter's Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid perfectly illustrates this phenomenon. Carter's book is a personal plea for renewed American engagement in the peace process, based largely on his considerable experience with these issues over the past 3 decades. Reasonable people may challenge his evidence or disagree with his conclusions, but his ultimate goal is peace between these two peoples, and Carter unambiguously defends Israel's right to live in peace and security. Yet, because he suggests that Israel's policies in the occupied territories resemble South Africa's apartheid regime, and said publicly that pro-Israel groups make it hard for U.S. leaders to pressure Israel to make peace, a number of these same groups launched a vicious smear campaign against him. Not only was Carter publicly accused of being an anti-Semite and a Jew hater, some critics even charged him with being sympathetic to Nazis. Since the lobby seeks to keep the present relationship intact, and because, in fact, its strategic and moral arguments are so weak, it has little choice but to try to stifle or marginalize serious discussion. Yet, despite the lobby's efforts, a considerable number of Americans, almost 40%, recognize that U.S. support for Israel is one of the main causes of anti-Americanism around the world. Among elites, the number is substantially higher. Furthermore, a surprising number of Americans understand that the lobby has a significant, not always positive influence on U.S. foreign policy. In a national poll taken in October 2006, 39% of the respondents said that they believe that the work of the Israeli lobby on Congress and the Bush administration has been a key factor for going to war in Iraq and now confronting Iran. In a 2006 survey of international relations scholars in the United States, 66% of the respondents said that they agreed with the statement, "The Israel lobby has too much influence over U.S. foreign policy." While the American people are generally sympathetic to Israel, many of them are critical of particular Israeli policies and would be willing to withhold American aid if Israel's actions are seen to be contrary to U.S. interests. Of course, the American public would be even more aware of the lobby's influence and more tough-minded with regard to Israel and its special relationship with the United States if there were a more open discussion of these matters. Still, one might wonder why, given the public's views about the lobby and Israel, politicians and policymakers are so unwilling to criticize Israel and to make aid to Israel conditional on whether its actions benefit the United States. The American people are certainly not demanding that their politicians support Israel down the line. In essence, there is a distinct gulf between how the broader public thinks about Israel and its relationship with the United States and how governing elites in Washington conduct American policy. The main reason for this gap is the lobby's formidable reputation inside the Beltway. Not only does it exert significant influence over the policy process in Democratic and Republican administrations alike, but it is even more powerful on Capitol Hill. Journalist Michael Massing reports that a congressional staffer sympathetic to Israel told him, "We can count on well over half the House, 250 to 300 members, to do reflexively whatever Aipac wants." Similarly, Stephen Rosen, the former Aipac official who has been indicted for allegedly passing classified government documents to Israel, illustrated Aipac's power for the New Yorker's Jeffrey Goldberg by putting a napkin in front of him and saying, "In 24 hours, we could have the signatures of 70 senators on this napkin." These are not idle boasts. As will become clear, when issues relating to Israel come to the fore, Congress almost always votes to endorse the lobby's positions, and usually in overwhelming numbers. Why is it so hard to talk about the Israel lobby? Because the United States is a pluralist democracy where freedom of speech and association are guaranteed, it was inevitable that interest groups would come to dominate the political process. As a nation of immigrants, it was equally inevitable that some of these interest groups would form along ethnic lines, and that they would try to influence U.S. foreign policy in various ways. Cuban Americans have lobbied to maintain the embargo on Castro's regime. Armenian Americans have pushed Washington to acknowledge the 1915 genocide and, more recently, to limit U.S. relations with Azerbaijan, and Indian Americans have rallied to support the recent security treaty and nuclear cooperation agreements. Such activities have been a central feature of American political life since the founding of the country, and pointing them out is rarely controversial. Yet it is clearly more difficult for Americans to talk openly about the Israel lobby. Part of the reason is the lobby itself, which is both eager to advertise its clout and quick to challenge anyone who suggests that its influence is too great or might be detrimental to U.S. interests. There are, however, other reasons why it is harder to have a candid discussion about the impact of the Israel lobby. To begin with, questioning the practices and ramifications of the Israel lobby may appear to some to be tantamount to questioning the legitimacy of Israel itself. Because some states still refuse to recognize Israel, and some critics of Israel and the lobby do question its legitimacy, many of its supporters may see even well-intentioned criticism as an implicit challenge to Israel's existence. given the strong feelings that many people have for Israel, and especially its important role as a safe haven for Jewish refugees from the Holocaust and as a central focus of contemporary Jewish identity, there is bound to be a hostile and defensive reaction when people think its legitimacy or its existence is under attack. But in fact, an examination of Israel's policies and the efforts of its American supporters does not imply an anti-Israel bias, just as an examination of the political activities of the American Association of Retired Persons, AARP, does not imply bias against older citizens. We are not challenging Israel's right to exist or questioning the legitimacy of the Jewish state. There are those who maintain that Israel should never have been created, or who want to see Israel transformed from a Jewish state into a binational democracy. We do not. On the contrary, we believe the history of the Jewish people and the norm of national self-determination provide ample justification for a Jewish state. We think the United States should stand willing to come to Israel's assistance if its survival were in jeopardy. And though our primary focus is on the Israel lobby's negative impact on U.S. foreign policy, we are also convinced that its influence has become harmful to Israel as well. In our view, both effects are regrettable. In addition, the claim that an interest group whose ranks are mostly Jewish has a powerful, not to mention negative influence on U.S. foreign policy is sure to make some Americans deeply uncomfortable and possibly fearful and angry, because it sounds like a charge lifted from the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that well-known anti-Semitic forgery that purported to reveal an all-powerful Jewish cabal exercising secret control over the world. Any discussion of Jewish political power takes place in the shadow of 2,000 years of history, especially the centuries of very real anti-Semitism in Europe. Christians massacred thousands of Jews during the Crusades, expelled them en masse from Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and other places between 1290 and 1497, and confined them to ghettos in other parts of Europe. Jews were violently oppressed during the Spanish Inquisition. Murderous pogroms took place in Eastern Europe and Russia on numerous occasions, and other forms of anti-Semitic bigotry were widespread until recently. This shameful record culminated in the Nazi Holocaust, which killed nearly 6 million Jews. Jews were also oppressed in parts of the Arab world, though much less severely. Given this long history of persecution, American Jews are understandably sensitive to any argument that sounds like someone is blaming them for policies gone awry. This sensitivity is compounded by the memory of bizarre conspiracy theories of the sort laid out in the Protocols. Dire warnings of secretive Jewish influence remain a staple of neo-Nazis and other extremists, such as the hate-mongering former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke, which reinforces Jewish concerns even more. A key element of such anti-Semitic accusations is the claim that Jews exercise illegitimate influence by controlling banks, the media, and other key institutions. Thus, if someone says that press coverage in the United States tends to favor Israel over its opponents, this may sound to some like the old canard that Jews control the media. Similarly, if someone points out that American Jews have a rich tradition of giving money to both philanthropic and political causes, it sounds like they're suggesting that Jewish money is buying political influence in an underhanded or conspiratorial way. Of course, anyone who gives money to a political campaign does so in order to advance some political cause, and virtually all interest groups hope to mold public opinion and are interested in getting favorable media coverage. Evaluating the role of any interest group's campaign contributions, lobbying efforts, and other political activities ought to be a fairly uncontroversial exercise. But given past anti-Semitism, one can understand why it is easier to talk about these matters when discussing the impact of the pharmaceutical lobby, labor unions, arms manufacturers, or Indian American groups, rather than the Israel lobby. Making this discussion of pro-Israel groups and individuals in the United States even more difficult is the age-old charge of dual loyalty. According to this old canard, Jews in the diaspora were perpetual aliens who could never assimilate and be good patriots because they were more loyal to each other than to the country in which they lived. The fear today is that Jews who support Israel will be seen as disloyal Americans. As Hyman Bookbinder, the former Washington representative of the American Jewish Committee, once commented, Jews react viscerally to the suggestion that there is something unpatriotic about their support for Israel. Let us be clear. We categorically reject all of these anti-Semitic claims. In our view, it is perfectly legitimate for any American to have a significant attachment to a foreign country. Indeed, Americans are permitted to hold dual citizenship and to serve in foreign armies, unless, of course, the other country is at war with the United States. As noted above, there are numerous examples of ethnic groups in America working hard to persuade the U.S. government, as well as their fellow citizens, to support the foreign country for which they feel a powerful bond. Foreign governments are usually aware of the activities of sympathetic, ethnically based interest groups, and they have naturally sought to use them to influence the U.S. government and advance their own foreign policy goals. Jewish Americans are no different from their fellow citizens in this regard. The Israel lobby is not a cabal or conspiracy or anything of the sort. It is engaged in good, old-fashioned interest group politics, which is as American as apple pie. Pro-Israel groups in the United States are engaged in the same enterprise as other interest groups like the National Rifle Association, NRA, the AARP, or professional associations like the American Petroleum Institute, which also work hard to influence congressional legislation and presidential priorities, and which, for the most part, operate in the open. With a few exceptions, to be discussed in subsequent chapters, the lobby's actions are thoroughly American and legitimate. We do not believe the lobby is all-powerful, or that it controls important institutions in the United States. As we will discuss in several subsequent chapters, there are a number of important cases where the lobby did not get its way. Nevertheless, there is an abundance of evidence that the lobby wields impressive influence. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, one of the most important pro-Israel groups, used to brag about its own power on its website, not only by listing its impressive achievements, but also by displaying quotations from prominent politicians that attested to its ability to influence events in ways that benefit Israel. For example, its website used to include a statement from former House Minority Leader Richard Gephardt, telling an Aipac gathering, "Without your constant support and all your fighting on a daily basis to strengthen the U.S.-Israeli relationship, it would not be." Even outspoken Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, who is often quick to brand Israel's critics as anti-Semites, wrote in a memoir that "My generation of Jews became part of what is perhaps the most effective lobbying and fundraising effort in the history of democracy. We did a truly great job as far as we allowed ourselves and were allowed to go." J.J. Goldberg, editor of the Jewish weekly newspaper Forward and the author of Jewish Power Inside the American Jewish Establishment, nicely captures the difficulty of talking about the lobby. It seems as though we're forced to choose between Jews holding vast and pernicious control or Jewish influence being non-existent. In fact, he notes, somewhere in the middle is a reality that none wants to discuss, which is that there is an entity called the Jewish community, made up of a group of organizations and public figures, that's part of the political rough and tumble, there's nothing wrong with playing the game like everybody else. We agree completely, but we think it is fair and indeed necessary to examine the consequences that this rough-and-tumble interest group politics can have on America and the world. How we make our case. To make our case, we have to accomplish 3 tasks. Specifically, we have to convince readers that the United States provides Israel with extraordinary material aid and diplomatic support, the lobby is the principal reason for that support, and this uncritical and unconditional relationship is not in the American national interest. To do so, we proceed as follows. Chapter 1, The Great Benefactor, addresses the first issue directly by describing the economic and military aid that the United States gives to Israel, as well as the diplomatic backing that Washington has provided in peace and in war. Subsequent chapters also discuss the different elements of U.S. Middle East policy that have been designed in whole or in part to benefit Israel vis-à-vis its various rivals. Chapters 2 and 3 assess the main arguments that are usually invoked to justify or explain the exceptional amount of support that Israel receives from the United States. This critical assessment is necessary for methodological reasons. In order to properly assess the impact of the Israel lobby, we have to examine other possible explanations that might account for the special relationship that now exists between the 2 countries. In Chapter 2, Israel, Strategic Asset or Liability, we examine the familiar argument that Israel deserves lavish support because it is a valuable strategic asset. We show that although Israel may have been an asset during the Cold War, it is now increasingly a strategic liability. Backing Israel so strongly helps fuel America's terrorism problem and makes it harder for the United States to address the other problems it faces in the Middle East. Unconditional support for Israel also complicates U.S. relations with a number of other countries around the world, thereby imposing additional costs on the United States. Yet even though the costs of backing Israel have risen while the benefits have declined, American support continues to increase. This situation suggests that something other than strategic imperatives is at work. Chapter 3, A Dwindling Moral Case, examines the different moral rationales that Israelis and their American supporters often use to explain U.S. support for the Jewish state. In particular, we consider the claim that the United States backs Israel because of shared democratic values, because Israel is a weak and vulnerable David facing a powerful Arab Goliath, because its past and present conduct is more ethical than its adversaries' behavior, or because it has always sought peace while its neighbors always chose war. This assessment is necessary not because we have any animus toward Israel or because we think its conduct is worse than that of other states, but because these essentially moral claims are so frequently used to explain why the United States should give Israel exceptional levels of aid. We conclude that while there is a strong moral case for Israel's existence, the moral case for giving it such generous and largely unconditional support is not compelling. Once again, this juxtaposition of a dwindling moral case and ever-increasing U.S. backing suggests that something else must be at work. Having established that neither strategic interests nor moral rationales can fully explain U.S. support for Israel, we turn our attention to that something else. Chapter 4, What is the Israel Lobby?, identifies the lobby's different components and describes how this loose coalition has evolved. We stress that it is not a single unified movement, that its different elements sometimes disagree on certain issues, and that it includes both Jews and non-Jews, including the so-called Christian Zionists. We also show how some of the most important organizations in the lobby have drifted rightward over time and are increasingly unrepresentative of the larger populations on whose behalf they often claim to speak. This chapter also considers whether Arab American groups, the so-called oil lobby, or wealthy Arab oil producers are either a significant counterweight to the Israel lobby or even the real driving forces behind U.S. Middle East policy. Many people seem to believe, for example, that the invasion of Iraq was mostly about oil and that corporate oil interests were the primary movers behind the U.S. decision to attack that country. This is not the case. Although access to oil is obviously an important U.S. interest, there are good reasons why Arab Americans, oil companies, and the Saudi royal family wield far less influence on U.S. foreign policy than the Israel lobby does. In Chapter 5, Guiding the Policy Process, and Chapter 6, Dominating Public Discourse, we describe the different strategies that groups in the lobby use in order to advance Israel's interests in the United States. In addition to direct lobbying on Capitol Hill, the lobby rewards or punishes politicians largely through an ability to guide the flow of campaign contributions. Organizations in the lobby also put pressure on the executive branch through a number of mechanisms, including working through government officials who are sympathetic to their views. Equally important, the lobby has gone to considerable lengths to shape public discourse about Israel by putting pressure on the media and academia and by establishing a tangible presence in influential foreign policy think tanks. Efforts to shape public perceptions often include charging critics of Israel with anti-Semitism, a tactic designed to discredit and marginalize anyone who challenges the current relationship. These tasks accomplished, Part 2 traces the lobby's role in shaping recent U.S. Middle East policy. Our argument, it should be emphasized, is not that the lobby is the only factor that influences U.S. decision-making in these issues. It is not omnipotent, so it does not get its way on every issue, but it is very effective in shaping U.S. policy toward Israel and the surrounding region in ways that are intended to benefit Israel and believed also to benefit the United States. Unfortunately, the policies it has successfully encouraged have actually done considerable harm to U.S. interests and have been harmful to Israel as well. Following a brief introduction to set the stage, Chapter 7, The Lobby versus the Palestinians, shows how the United States has consistently backed Israel's efforts to quell or limit the Palestinians' national aspirations. Even when American presidents put pressure on Israel to make concessions or try to distance the United States from Israel's policies, as President George W. Bush has attempted to do on several occasions since September 11, the lobby intervenes and brings them back into line. The result has been a worsening image for the United States, continued suffering on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian divide, and a growing radicalization among the Palestinians. None of these trends is in America's or Israel's interest. In Chapter 8, Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East, we show how the lobby, and especially the neoconservatives within it, was the principal driving force behind the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq in 2003. We emphasize that the lobby did not cause the war by itself. The September 11 attacks had a profound impact on the Bush administration's foreign policy and the decision to topple Saddam Hussein. But absent the lobby's influence, there almost certainly would not have been a war. The lobby was a necessary but not sufficient condition for a war that is a strategic disaster for the United States and a boon for Iran, Israel's most serious regional adversary. Chapter 9, Taking Aim at Syria, describes the evolution of America's difficult relationship with the Assad regime in Syria. We document how the lobby has pushed Washington to adopt confrontational policies towards Syria, including occasional threats of regime change, when doing so was what the Israeli government wanted. The United States and Syria would not be allies if key groups in the lobby were less influential, but the United States would have taken a much less confrontational approach and might even be cooperating with Syria in a number of limited but useful ways. Indeed, absent the lobby, there might already be a peace treaty between Israel and Syria, and Damascus might not be backing Hezbollah in Lebanon, which would be good for both Washington and Jerusalem. In Chapter 10, Iran in the Crosshairs, we trace the lobby's role in U.S. policy toward Iran. Washington and Tehran have had difficult relations since the 1979 revolution that overthrew the Shah, and Israel has come to see Iran as its most serious adversary, in light of its nuclear ambitions and its support for groups like Hezbollah. Accordingly, Israel and the lobby have repeatedly pushed the United States to go after Iran and have acted to derail several earlier opportunities for détente. The result, unfortunately, is that Iran's nuclear ambitions have increased, and more extreme elements, such as current President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, have come to power, making a difficult situation worse. Lebanon is the subject of Chapter 11, the lobby and the Second Lebanon War, and the pattern is much the same. We argue that Israel's response to Hezbollah's unjustified provocation in the summer of 2006 was both strategically foolish and morally wrong. Yet the lobby's influence made it hard for U.S. officials to do anything except strongly back Israel. This case offers yet another classic illustration of the lobby's regrettable influence on American and Israeli interests. By making it hard for U.S. policymakers to step back and give their Israeli counterparts honest and critical advice, the lobby facilitated a policy that further tarnished America's image, weakened the democratically elected regime in Beirut, and strengthened Hezbollah. The final chapter, What is to be Done, explores how this unfortunate situation might be improved. We begin by identifying America's core Middle East interests and then sketch the essential principles of strategy, which we term offshore balancing, that could defend these interests more effectively. We do not call for abandoning the U.S. commitment to Israel. Indeed, we explicitly endorse coming to Israel's aid if its survival were ever in jeopardy. But we argue that it is time to treat Israel like a normal country, and to make U.S. aid conditional on an end to the occupation and on Israel's willingness to conform its policies to American interests. Accomplishing this shift requires addressing the political power of the lobby and its current policy agenda, and we offer several suggestions for how the power of the lobby might be modified to make its influence more beneficial for the United States and Israel alike. Those we learned from. No author is an island, and we owe a considerable debt to other scholars and writers who examined these subjects before we did. To begin with, there is the extensive academic literature on interest groups that helped us understand how small but focused movements can exert influence far greater than their absolute numbers within the population might suggest. There is also a robust literature on the impact of ethnic groups on U.S. foreign policy, which confirms that the Israel lobby is not unique in its basic activities, only in its unusual level of influence. A second body of literature addresses the lobby itself. A number of journalists, scholars, and former politicians have written about the lobby. Written from both critical and sympathetic perspectives, these works contain a considerable amount of useful information on the ways that the lobby has worked to influence U.S. foreign policy. We hope our account will extend the trail that these earlier writers blazed. We have also learned a great deal from other studies, too numerous to list in toto, that deal with particular aspects of U.S. Middle East policy, U.S.-Israeli relations, or specific policy issues. Although some of these works, such as Stephen Spiegel's The Other Arab-Israeli Conflict, Making America's Middle East Policy from Truman to Reagan, and Warren Bass's Support Any Friend, Kennedy's Middle East Policy and the Making of the U.S.-Israel Alliance, tend to downplay the lobby's influence, serious works of scholarship such as these nonetheless contain considerable evidence of the lobby's impact, and especially its growing clout. There is a final body of literature that has played an important role in helping us to think about Israel, the lobby, and America's relationship with the Jewish state. We refer to the so-called new history that has come out of Israel over the past 20 years. Using extensive archival research, Israeli scholars like Shlomo Ben-Ami, Simha Flappen, Baruch Kimmerling, Benny Morris, Ilan Pape, Tom Segeyev, Avi Shleim, and Ziv Sternhell have effectively overturned the conventional wisdom on Israel's founding and on its subsequent policies toward both the surrounding states and the Palestinians. Scholars from other countries have also contributed to setting the historical record straight. Together, these individuals have undermined the original, highly romanticized version of the founding, in which the Jews are usually portrayed as the white hats and the Arabs as the black hats. Moreover, these works make clear that after Israel gained its independence, it behaved much more aggressively toward the Palestinians and other Arabs than is commonly recognized. There are various disputes among these historians, of course, and we do not agree with every point they make. Nevertheless, the story they collectively tell is not just a matter of academic interest. In fact, it has profound implications for how one thinks about the moral rationale for supporting Israel over the Palestinians. It also helps one understand why so many people in the Arab and Islamic world are deeply angry at the United States for supporting Israel so generously and unconditionally. A note on sources. A brief word about sources is in order before we proceed. Much of this study, especially Part 2, deals with recent history, or with events whose ultimate outcome remains uncertain. Because official documents regarding contemporary events are normally unavailable to scholars, we have been forced to rely on other sources: newspapers, magazines, scholarly articles, books, reports from human rights organizations, radio and television transcripts, and personal interviews that we conducted. In a few instances, we had to work with an admittedly spotty record of events. Although we think it is unlikely, some parts of our story may look different once official records become available. In order to ensure that our various arguments are correct, we backed up virtually every significant point with multiple sources, which accounts for the extensive notes provided at the end of this book. We also relied heavily on Israeli sources like Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post, as well as the writings of Israeli scholars. Another indispensable source of information was American Jewish publications like Forward and Jewish Week. Not only are these Israeli and Jewish American sources filled with important information that is not found in the mainstream media in the United States, these newspapers were by and large not likely to be sympathetic to many of our arguments about the lobby. Our reliance on them should help make our conclusions even more reliable. Conclusion. Our analysis begins by describing the material and diplomatic support that the United States provides to Israel. The fact that America gives considerable support to the Jewish state is hardly headline news, but readers may be surprised to learn just how extensive and varied this largesse actually is. Documenting that support is the subject of the next chapter.